Welcome to Unlocking the Dream Vision. I'm your host, author R.J. von-Bruening. In this video series, we'll be exploring the mysterious dream vision of Enoch as explored in my book, Unlocking the Dream Vision, The Secret History of Creation. In this video, we'll take a look at who the gods really are. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos. This series presents information based in part upon theory and conjecture of the system of esoteric symbolism. The purpose is to suggest some possible interpretation, but not necessarily the only one, to the many mysteries we will explore. Welcome back. We pick up where we left off in the last video, and when the so-called gods returned to Earth, and a better understanding of the events surrounding this return. Given everything we've learned up to this point, I think it's reasonable to argue that they returned to Earth roughly 900,000 years ago. The primary reason for this is because around this time we begin seeing Homo erectus start to undergo a number of physical changes and split into numerous subgroups that we typically refer to as advanced forms of Homo erectus, one of which is our direct ancestor. Due to the incredible difficulties they must have encountered because of Earth's stronger gravity, they would have naturally been searching for a solution for the problem of not being able to spend much time on or near the surface of the Earth. This allows us to begin understanding that they would have begun trying to use Homo erectus as a form of slave labor in the first place. The ancient myths and legends also imply that their first attempts to solve this problem was with technology, with it taking the form of massive, possibly fully automated mining machines to get at the metal and raw materials that they needed. This must have had several limitations as they clearly began to utilize Homo erectus to perform tasks and labor for their mining operations. The fact that Homo erectus was unable to understand them or view them in any fashion except as being gods, they must have been viewed as kind of a bonus to the situation, as an almost perfect slave animal from their point of view. Just smart enough to be trained and perform different tasks, but far too primitive and mentally limited to understand them as anything but an all-powerful god. A trait that they appear to have encouraged in our ancient ancestors for thousands upon thousands of years. By using our ancient ancestor Homo erectus as a beast of burden combined with their technology appears to have had its own set of limitations. These unknown limitations combined with unknown societal and cultural pressures over time led to some type of rebellion among the workers on the earth. These unknown limitations combined with an unknown societal and cultural pressures over time led to a rebellion of the workforce on earth. As we know from the ancient myths, this first rebellion among the gods resulted in the creation of the first men, a more perfect slave with the ability to work on its own or with very little supervision from the gods. This new man would allow the gods to minimize their time on or near the surface of the earth. Although the first men could perform the necessary labor on their own, we are told that several of the gods were assigned to or volunteered to watch over and guide this more independent workforce of slaves. These are, of course, the famous Watchers and their ever-famous leader, Lucifer, the great Lord of Light. As you will shortly learn, there is an important reason why I say they may have volunteered for this task. As we learn from our journey through the mystical symbolism of the dream vision, this time of the Watchers looking after the first men may have lasted at least 30,000 to 40,000 years, possibly even longer. During this time, the Watchers began slowly readapting to Earth's gravity. Although they appear to have spent less time on the surface of the Earth, their constant coming and going with large amounts of time sitting in their ships at a distance watching the first men, as we're told in the Book of Enoch. They slowly become stronger and stronger, and each time they come to Earth or near Earth, they could stay a little bit longer than they did the last time. After hundreds or even possibly thousands of years, they actually become strong enough and become acclimated to Earth's gravity that they can exist on the surface of the Earth on a permanent basis. This would cause another unique problem that goes a long way to explaining the next set of important events surrounding what's known as the fall of the Watchers. This readaptation to live on Earth only happened to the Watchers and none of the others of their species, which of course makes perfect sense because they would have been the only ones entering into Earth's stronger gravity on a regular basis. This would have caused a very unique set of problems. Eventually, these Watchers would become so incredibly physically strong when compared to the others of their race, they would become a danger to everyone around them. This in and by itself would have caused several unique problems, just not for the Watchers that adapted to live on the surface of the Earth, but it would also cause other problems in their whole society. Like I said before, their massive strength would have made them a great danger to others of their kind, and they could accidentally cause serious injury or possibly even death of someone without even trying or meaning to. This would also raise another unique problem. These Watchers would have found it very difficult or next to impossible to have any type of physical sexual relations with the opposite sex of their species. In the ancient accounts, including the Book of Enoch, they all speak of how the Watchers were male and they did not have any wives. Almost the entire 15th chapter of the Book of Enoch speaks of how the Watchers were not given wives and how in their lust their hearts filled with sin and they turned to human women for wives. With the understanding that they most likely had a highly controlled society, especially when it came to their population, we can now begin to understand why I said earlier that the Watchers may have volunteered for this difficult duty. They may have been promised the opportunity to marry and have children long before they normally would have been able to, given the rigid population controls that we speculate may have existed in their society. This would help explain why this point becomes the entire focus of the rebellion of the Watchers in the first place. In addition, it is possible that the Watchers had any number of other promises that were made to them that were sooner or later eventually broken. This entire situation would naturally lead to the Watchers becoming isolated from the rest of their people and possibly being forced to stay on Earth all the time. By understanding this, it then allows us to begin understanding why the monumental event of the star that fell from heaven and the event known as the fall of the Watchers may have happened and why they would have wanted to take human wives in the first place. It also allows us to begin answering one of the greatest mysteries of all time of how the fallen Watchers were able to mate with the early humans in the first place. We can now easily imagine how the Watchers must have felt betrayed and abandoned by their people, especially when they start becoming isolated and having stayed on Earth for such a long period of time. Over time, these frustrations and the anger from broken promises, the isolation, would have just kept growing until they reached a breaking point. Soon after, these Watchers decided upon and formed a plan to break away from their people and their rigid society and form their own. This would, of course, require them to capture and control the heaven, so the government authority of their civilization back on Mars would not be able to stop them. Now, with our understanding about their incredible strength when compared to the others of their kind, we can start to realize it is possible that this all may have been a rather bloodless affair, with them just using their great physical strength to force the others to submit to their authority. As we've seen throughout the entire story, the civilization and society does not appear to have much of any actual military ability or any real security forces to speak of. Which is not that surprising given the possibility of this rigid, unchanging society that they appear to have created. Tradition by itself and the common origin of all of them seems to be all that was necessary to hold this society together. They simply had no military or security forces because they simply never actually needed them or had any use for them. This then brings us to one of the greatest mysteries in how the fallen Watchers may have or could have mated with the first humans in the first place. In order for us to answer this mystery, we need to pause for a few minutes and take a small step backwards to learn the secret of this mystery. For us to understand how the fallen watchers could have possibly mated with early humans, we first must remember that they are originally from Earth. The next thing is to realize that because they were originally from Earth, and that everything indicates that the watchers and the humans were very similar to each other in many ways. We can thus realize for the first time in modern human history that our two different species must have had a common ancestor at some point in time, millions upon millions of years ago. Once we can grasp this idea, we can then apply our modern understanding of the evolutionary theory to begin piecing this puzzle back together. This part of the story begins around 20 to 22 million years ago, when our common ancestors split into at least two separate genetic lines. One went on to evolve into them around 14 million years ago, while the other one became what we call the hominid line, and is the line that we come from. The earliest fossil evidence we have of this line has shown that it's around 15 million years ago or so, the line separated into what will become the great apes, and then which we are descended from, and into the ancestors of the lesser apes or Gibeon apes, commonly known as the monkeys. At around 13 million years ago, the ancestors of what will become the orangutans separated from this line. Around 10 million years ago, this line splits again into two lines, with one being the ancestors of the modern-day gorillas and the other being the Pan line. Then around 6 to 7 million years ago, this line separates into two distinct genetic lines. One goes on to evolve and develop into modern-day chimpanzees and our closest living relatives, who actually share 98.7% of the same DNA as we do. Not only are they very closely related to us genetically, they also exhibit several of the same expressions, mannerisms, and social behavior as we humans display on a daily basis. The other line goes on to become us. By understanding this, on how we could be genetically related to them, we can now realize, using us and our modern day closest relatives as examples, that approximately 14 million years ago, we can speculate that they were much like us, and our ancestors at the time were much like the chimpanzees and our closest relatives are of today. This allows us to speculate that if the chimpanzees and our closest relatives managed to survive our destructive ways in our civilization, they are most likely the next line that will evolve intelligence and reach our point of development within the next 20 million years or so. If by some chance our descendants are still around or come back to Earth at that time, they should find an intelligent creature that looks and acts much as we do today. More importantly, they will be very closely related to them, just as we are to them. This allows us to realize that not only are we closely related to each other, but that the actual genetic differences between the two species are very small. Again, using us and our modern day closest relatives as an example, and modern evolutionary theory, we can begin to understand that they should be very, very small genetic differences between them and us to begin with. Theoretically, this genetic difference should be somewhere between 1 to 4% difference between us and them, which means that the vast majority of our DNA is exactly the same. This knowledge then allows us to understand how the mysterious mating between the fallen watchers and the first humans may have happened in the first place. It was simply because we are both very closely genetically related to each other. Would also share a number of the same expressions, mannerisms, and social behaviors because we have a common ancestor. They would have found our ancient ancestors remarkably similar to themselves as we do today with our closest living relatives, but much farther along both physically and mentally than they are today. This then brings us to the next important factor towards understanding how the fallen watchers were able to take human women as their wives and consummate with them. Common sense tells us, and logic quickly allows us to figure out, that it would be physically impossible for the average 16-foot tall fallen watchers to have sexual intercourse with an approximately 5-foot tall Neanderthal female. Taking all these possibilities together allows us to be able to figure out what might actually have happened all those many millennium ago. Using the knowledge that we have already gained, we can deduce that the fallen watchers did not actually mate with Neanderthal females, as so many traditions believe, primarily because they could physically not do it. To understand who the fallen watchers must have mated with, we need to return to the many ancient Greek myths about Zeus. By doing so, we can begin understanding a much more realistic chain of events. In these ancient myths, we are told that Zeus would seduce or abduct a poor hapless human woman, where she would then have some type of divine mating with him and then would be returned. Then 9 months later, she would give birth to a half-god, half-man, or Nephilim. This then allows us to begin understanding that it is much more likely that this seduced Neanderthal female would have been impregnated with a modified human fetus. In addition to being aware of how closely related we may actually be to this other species, we can now understand that much of this would have been more of a process of turning certain genes on and off in a process known as epigenetics, to just get the traits that they desired and not actually splicing any new genes or DNA into their genetic structure. This is why we do not find any strange alien DNA within ourselves. In this case, for example, they would only need to activate genes that would produce a much larger human with more of the physical characteristics brought out that make them appear more like the fallen watchers and less like a hairy little Neanderthal. This allows us to realize for the first time in modern history that the fallen watchers must have mated with the Nephilim and not actually with human females, as is traditionally believed. When we combine this with our modern understanding of genetics, we can then realize that this mating between the fallen watchers and the Nephilim that would have given birth to the hybrid giants. This understanding allows us to realize that it was probably the primary reason why the fallen watchers and the Nephilim never appeared to do anything to stop the violence of the giants, is simply because they were in fact their children. Additionally, in the ancient stories, we were told that not only could the Nephilim mate with the fallen watchers, they could also mate back with humans, but also with the giants themselves. We're also told that the smaller of the giants could and commonly did capture and mate with human females that produced some type of viable offspring. The mythologies also imply that the giants could also mate with the fallen watchers. This allows us to begin understanding of how their genetics and ours eventually became mixed. With our understanding of how this mating between the fallen watchers and the first humans may have occurred, we can now begin to finally understand that by extending out our lifespans for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, they all may be rather psychologically unstable by our standards. This appears to be reflected in the fact that the fallen angels were able to justify their actions in their own minds and be able to justify this sophisticated form of a sexual crime known as bestiality, or sex with animals. Unsurprisingly, the ancient texts that we know of tell us that the others of their kind viewed this almost much in the way we would today, as a complete and utter abomination, a sexual crime that not only was against the laws of nature, but also against the laws of God. Combined with the fact that it appears that they rebelled against their people and civilization, possibly killing many of their own kind in the process in order to commit this crime. They must have been viewed as being mentally deranged, as sexual criminals who would go to any lengths to feed their sick sexual desires. Adding to all this would be the fact that they captured the heaven, and this would have allowed them total control of all the resources it produced, effectively putting them in total economic control of their entire civilization. We can only imagine the absolute political, economic, and social chaos that something like this would have caused for their civilization, much less one that was millions of years old, built around a rigid set of population controls and social order. Not only do they appear to have taken control of the earth, the heaven, and possibly their entire economy, our latest research supports the idea that they may have undertaken a total genetic transformation of the entire ecosystem of Earth. In a landmark study of new research that involved analyzing millions of DNA barcodes, it was discovered that it appears that approximately 90% of all current animal species only came into physical existence between 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. In this massive genetic study, it was discovered that virtually 90% of all animals on the earth appeared at about the same time. More specifically, they found that 9 out of 10 animal species on the planet came into being simultaneously at roughly the same time as humans did some 100 to 200,000 years ago. What makes this discovery truly remarkable is that with our new understanding of the mystical symbolism and its secret story of creation, we can realize that this could actually be evidence for not only the creation story of Genesis, but also provides an important insight to the events surrounding the fall of the Watchers, giving a better understanding of the vague stories surrounding this dark and mysterious time. If we pause for a moment and return to the time before the fall of the Watchers, we can realize that the ancient stories may be speaking of this great and destructive power of the Titans and the elder gods, may in fact be telling us of when these gods returned to Earth. They began a massive and highly destructive resource extraction program with very little regard to the overall impact on the environment or the animal species. A mining and resource extraction program that was so incredibly destructive for the environment that it may have actually threatened all life on the planet. This type of environmental destruction would help explain why the Watchers appeared to be so willing to turn against their own people and their own ancient traditions. It could have been because they were trying to stop the destruction of an entire world. It is also possible that the actual star that fell from heaven, remembered as Lucifer and his fellow Watchers, may not have been the relatively bloodless affair as proposed earlier. It could have in fact been a highly destructive and very deadly war that resulted in almost all the animal species on Earth being wiped out. After the victorious Lord of Light and his fellow fallen Watchers had assumed command of the heaven and established their new rule over Earth, they then began a large-scale environmental engineering program to repair the damage from their rebellion and said war. Additionally, given what we've already learned, it cannot be ruled out that the mighty Lord of Light and the other Watchers were also so insane at this point that they used their knowledge and technology to literally create a new world in their image, in order for them to pretend to be actual gods that they believe themselves to do, truly ruling over a world of their own making. With understanding how it may have been possible for the Watchers to mate with humans and their original connection to Earth, it is also possible that after this destruction of upwards of 90% of the animal species, that they did not actually create animal species from scratch, but they were in fact all the different animal species they originally took to Mars millions of years earlier. This could be evidence that they were originally terraforming Mars with life which would have been originally from Earth if they were actually terraforming Mars from a rather lifeless world into a much more Earth-like world, much as we are planning to do. It seems to make perfect sense that any life on Mars would have been originally from Earth. But as we now know, the animals would have needed to have been genetically modified for them to be reintroduced to Earth's much more hostile environment and stronger gravity. Finally, although we might not know the exact details, this discovery combined with our new knowledge of the secret history of creation allows us to truly understand why the Gnostics, the ancient Greeks, and many other ancient people believed the mighty Lord of Light, or Lucifer, was the true creator of this world. It also allows us to understand that the Gnostic belief that the God spoken of in Genesis is actually the Lord of Light, Lucifer, and is, again, the creator of this physical world. And it is not quite as heretical as you've been led to believe by the monotheistic traditions, especially the Catholic Church. All of this allows us to begin understanding why the fallen watchers were dealt with so harshly when their government authority of their civilization was finally able to regain control. We can now understand how the fallen watchers may have lost control of the situation that allowed the other side to destroy their new paradise of where they were the gods. In all the ancient myths and stories of this time, they tell us the same basic series of events. That the giants and possibly some of the Nephilim began turning against everyone else, and they became uncontrollably violent, committing crimes against both man, beast, and nature in general. Within chapter 7 of the Book of Enoch, we are told they consumed all the acquisitions of men, and when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. The earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. This violent behavior of the lawless giants keeps growing until they ultimately begin turning against their fathers, the fallen watchers, and their mothers, the female Nephilim. Traditionally, it is believed that the giants become so violent and disrupted that they begin to threaten the entire paradise of the fallen watchers that they had built. This finally forces the watchers to act against the giants, their children. It is at this point that the others of their kind were able to regain control of heaven. It also allowed them to begin unleashing the long overdue justice upon these most hideous of sexual criminals and political radicals their civilization has most likely ever known. With the understanding of the physical limitation of the others of their kind who have not spent the same amount of time on Earth, we can begin understanding that the events that are remembered as the Great Flood now begin to make a lot more sense than they ever did before. It would have been the easiest way for them to solve several different problems at once. It would have allowed them to defeat the fallen watchers and their followers without having to be on the surface of the earth for any extended amount of time. A massive flood would solve both problems, and they could defeat the fallen watchers by wiping out their followers and children once and for all. This would then weaken them to the point that the governmental forces would be able to capture the fallen watchers and put them on trial for their crimes. It is very well known that the fallen watchers were found guilty of their crimes and punished for them. Although there is not any actual written material on this particular matter of the punishment of the fallen watchers, the oral tradition is rich with important information and something that helps seem to answer a long-standing modern-day mystery of just who the great aliens of modern UFO lore are. Within the oral tradition of the punishment of Lucifer and his fellow fallen watchers, it is said that they were first stripped of their godly and divine power. After they were stripped of their power, it is believed that they were physically transformed into demons, devils, and lost souls that were then exiled to earth with only the power of temptation. When this is combined with everything else we've learned, we can begin understanding that their physical transformation into demons was a form of punishment that is currently far beyond our most advanced medical technology, although it has been speculated about in science fiction for many years. This punishment of the fallen watchers appears to have consisted of them basically downloading the fallen watchers' minds into a physical body that made it simply impossible for them ever to recommit their sexual crimes. A small, weak, asexual, and visually ugly body when compared to what they once were. And this is exactly what is described and reported as the atypical gray alien of popular UFO culture and lore. I do have to admit, this is a unique and rather fitting form of punishment for their sexual crimes. After the fallen watchers are defeated and punished, it appears that the governmental authority of their civilization then tries to reestablish the prior slave society that they had before. As we already know, this effort does eventually fail, and it results in the creation of a new human, the Son of Man, the one we know as Cro-Magnon Man. Although it is impossible to say why they felt it was necessary to do this, but based on what we've just learned, I think it is reasonable to suspect it was because of the influence of the fallen watchers who were exiled to Earth. Although the fallen watchers had been physically changed and stripped of their power or ships, the Neanderthal workforce would have probably viewed them as the true gods and rulers and not the other ones that have recaptured the heaven. In addition, the civilization would still have been rather dependent on the fallen watchers, primarily because the others of their kinds would still have the same problem as before with Earth's gravity. What makes this creation of the Son of Man, or Cro-Magnon Man, so unique from before is that their government authority decides to take a small group of these new humans and condition them to only follow and worship the leader of the government authority as the one true Lord God. It appears that this was done in order to reduce or possibly even destroy the influence of the fallen watchers on Earth. This tactic appears to have been rather successful because eventually it does set up the events and conditions that start a new war, the start of which is marked by the events of Enoch being taken away from the generations of the Earth. The event that is still symbolically remembered to this very day on the back of every single $1 bill the world over. This first phase of the war appears to have been very short-lived, with an agreement quickly being made between the warring parties. This then brings us to the time of the mysterious shepherds and the great slaughter that they unleashed upon our Cro-Magnon Man ancestors. The actions of the shepherds give a small peek into the agreement that was made between the warring parties. It seems rather obvious by the actions of the shepherds and that the agreement must have been about reducing the influence of the 12 tribes of Israel. It also seems related to restoring the power and influence of the fallen watchers over the workforce that supplied the raw materials for their entire civilization. The dream vision clearly tells us that the government authority of these people did not trust or believe that the fallen watchers and their allies, possibly the shepherds, would honor their agreement. Given what we're told in the dream vision, it is reasonable to think that the government authority, or the Lord God faction as I've been referring to them, was building a political case that the fallen watchers held too much power and influence, with the general idea that they needed to be removed or possibly even wiped out for the good of their civilization. This would help explain why the fallen watchers and their allies attacked the heaven with the hope of possibly destroying it. It is almost natural to realize that once the fallen watchers had discovered that the others of their kind were planning a campaign of possibly destroying them once and for all, they would have naturally decided that they needed to destroy the heaven in order to save themselves from this oncoming destruction. It would also have the added benefit of it making it very difficult, if not impossible, for the authorities of their government to stop them once the heaven had been removed from the equation. It is hard not to think that they would have believed this would finally give them the freedom to follow their deep-seated desires and recreate the lost paradise. As we already know, this course of action clearly backfired and ended up having the total opposite effect, with our new knowledge of the mighty heaven, and that it was the linchpin of their entire civilization. We can now realize that losing this massive processing facility could and would have most likely been a death blow to their entire civilization. It's highly probable that their civilization would not have been able to recover from it, and would not only risk their civilization and put it at the risk of collapse, but it also put their entire species at the risk of extinction. Once you realize the importance of the heaven to their entire civilization, then the rest of the story kind of begins to come into clear focus. By understanding the importance of the ship, it is easy to understand that its loss would and clearly did start a war of total annihilation against the fallen watchers and their allies. It is not hard to imagine how the rest of their people would have viewed the fallen watchers as just being far too dangerous and just too great of a threat to be allowed to live. It also appears that their suspicion that the fallen watchers could not be trusted to honor any agreements with them was warranted also. As we have learned through the ancient texts, This war of annihilation was very effective, with the ancient accounts telling us that upwards of around 80% of the population was killed by war, famine, and disease, with the remainder fighting and dying in final battles, with only a small number of our ancient ancestors being saved from the Great Destruction. This brings us to one of the most important and terrifying aspects of this war of total annihilation: the final destruction of their whole civilization, and Mars being turned into a frozen, dead wasteland that it is today. As we know, this war of total annihilation against the Fallen Watchers was very effective. It was so effective that it appears that it forced the Fallen Watchers to make a fateful and incredibly insane decision: the decision to destroy the entire civilization on Mars. This was accomplished by taking the two largest asteroids in orbit around Mars, the ones we call Phobos and Deimos, and altered their orbits in order to force all the other mined out asteroids and debris to fall into Mars. It is also highly probable that several nuclear devices were also used to aid in this destruction. Again, this idea may seem a little fantastic at first to have really happened, but it does help to answer a couple of very important mysteries about Mars. Once the Fallen Watchers had altered the orbits of Phobos and Deimos, no force in the universe could stop what would happen next. This altering of their orbits would knock all the other hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of mined out asteroids and other debris, and billions upon billions of tons of debris out of their orbits, causing them all to plunge into Mars. This is an event that we have great difficulty getting our minds around, for it is hard for us to imagine the effect of hundreds of thousands of asteroids plunging into the atmosphere, some burning up, with many others exploding, but most of them surviving until they hit the ground, with each one exploding with the force of dozens and dozens of atomic bombs. This type of bombardment would be so great and release so much energy and heat that it would have literally boiled away the oceans and burned away much of the atmosphere. The surface of Mars would have literally been turned into a place worse than our darkest ideas of hell. In addition, this massive bombardment was so destructive and released so much energy that it appears that it may have collapsed any magnetic field of the planet of Mars. This would have just added to the destruction by allowing the solar wind to begin slowly stripping away the outer parts of Mars' atmosphere. One of the more striking things about this almost unimaginable bombardment of Mars is that it also allows us to answer one of the greatest mysteries of Mars and why the surface of the planet is red. As this massive bombardment was taking place, it vaporized not only asteroids, but more importantly, it vaporized any metal left in them. It would also vaporize everything on the surface, including their cities and any other structures they had built over the eons. All this vaporized metal is just too heavy to have been blasted back into space or to be stripped away by the solar wind. So very simply, after this great destruction and the atmosphere began to cool from this heavenly bombardment of fiery death, all this new vaporized metal would also begin to cool and mix with any remaining oxygen and slowly start raining down on the surface of Mars, thereby leaving a thin layer of rusted metal covering the entire planet. This rust is actually the ash of this unbelievable, terrible event with the total destruction of their civilization. It also helps explain why there are over 635,000 plus craters on the surface of Mars, at least 1 kilometer across, and also why the majority of these craters are located on the highlands of Mars, an area which would have been far above the waterline of the oceans that are suspected to have existed on Mars. This allows us to understand that the number of asteroids was most likely 2 to 3 times as many as there are craters, with many of them exploding in or over the oceans before they boiled away. Again, this is a level of destruction that we can't even really get our minds around. In fact, it is such an incredible event that we don't even have any real word to describe it. In fact, we just call it an extinction level event, which still does not even come close to expressing the sheer horror and overwhelming terror the victims must have experienced in their final moments of this great destruction. Additionally, This is not even including the unimaginable loss of possibly up to 14 million years of history, culture, and civilization that was wiped out in the course of just a few days, or the fact that their entire world was deliberately turned into a cold, lifeless wasteland by this great war. This terrible event and destruction caused by the actions of the fallen watchers is possibly the best example of the possible mental state of not only the fallen watchers, but of their people as a whole. By our modern standards, all these actions of the gods are clearly and completely insane and not the work of fully rational minds. Because who but a total insane madman would be able to justify the genocidal mass murder of an entire civilization on a planetary scale? As you can imagine, the destruction of their entire civilization and the deaths of an unknown number of people quickly changed this war of annihilation into a war of survival for both sides. This would also have given the surviving people of the civilization ample motivation for wanting to totally wipe out the other side and their allies and any of their human followers at the time, which exactly is recorded in the Bible's Book of Revelation in the great final battle known as Armageddon. This then brings us to one of the most important factors in this entire story, the remnant that was saved. All this information allows us to realize that the Lord God faction, or the governmental authority of this civilization, or at least what was left of it after the great destruction of Mars and their civilization, did not seem to have saved our ancestors out of the goodness of their hearts, but they did it for their own selfish reasons. That is highly likely that it was done in order to preserve a portion of the needed workforce. This appears to be exactly what we're told in the Book of Revelation. That it is also what we have learned in our journey through the mystical symbolism of the dream vision, where we have learned that the ones that were saved were transformed into a new Neanderthal-like slave with a slightly more complex brain than before, and then tasked to serve their God and Lamb forever and ever. As we also learned in our journey of the nation of Edom, and how a residue of the children of Ishu would also serve the Lord God until the end of time as their punishment for taking up arms against their brother Jacob. This then brings us to the fallen watchers and their actions to save our ancestors. The sad truth is there's absolutely no evidence, including within the oral tradition, that the fallen watchers did anything to actually save anyone but themselves. In fact, everything we know about the fallen watchers points to the conclusion that at the very end, the great Lord of Light and his fallen watchers appear to have ultimately betrayed and abandoned their human followers, leaving them all to die. Which is something to kind of keep in mind when you're thinking about these individuals. But ultimately, in the end, it seems that both sides betrayed and abandoned their human followers and only saved themselves. The few of our ancestors that they did save were eventually turned into slaves once again. Additionally, to this very day, the gods and their followers have been trying incredibly hard to convince everyone that they are some type of extraterrestrial alien and not the completely evil, insane, genocidal monsters they appear to truly be. All of this should make one to wonder that there's absolutely nothing that supports the idea that these insane monsters won't do it all over again. This new understanding of the fallen watchers and the gods as a whole allows us to begin speculating that the most likely reason the gray aliens of UFO lore are abducting people is because they are trying to figure out how to get out of those weak, asexual, ugly bodies and back into a much more human-like form. In addition, we can also say with some confidence that one of their primary reasons for this would be so they could commit the same crimes they did before. Additionally, if the modern culture UFO lore can be believed, and the Greys are in fact in contact or working with several governments and militaries of the world, we can understand for the first time that it's highly probable that these Greys have been lying to all the people that they are allegedly working with. Also highly probable that the people working with these things may not have any idea that they are actually working with an incredibly insane evil that almost destroyed everything so long ago. This realization then allows us to begin understanding the long-standing claim that sometime during the early to mid-1950s, the United States government was allegedly contacted by two different groups of aliens. The story claims that one group were the ever-famous gray aliens with their big heads and black almond-shaped eyes, with the others being the less-known Tall Nordics, also commonly known as the Tall Whites. They're also known as the Pleiades in UFO lore. The story then goes on to state that in the early 1950s, both groups offered help to humanity after the horrors of World War II. The Greys are said to have offered technology and knowledge in exchange for being allowed to abduct and study humans. The Tall Nordics are said to have offered help with our spiritual development on the conditions that we humans abandon all further nuclear weapon research and development, and with the claim that they also wanted to help rid ourselves of these new weapons. It is claimed that when the Tall Nordics were asked about exchanging technology, they refused and said that we were simply too spiritually immature for the technologies we already possessed. As most are already aware, the offer from the Greys is the one that was allegedly agreed to by the U.S. government at the time. The reason commonly given for the Tall Nordics offer being rejected was because the United States government at the time thought it would leave us defenseless against their obviously superior technology. Now, with us being aware that their people may have experienced two great and terrible destructions that destroyed their entire civilization, possibly on two separate different times in their history, their request for us to get rid of our nuclear weapons begins to make a lot more sense. Because they have firsthand knowledge that no matter what, sooner or later, we will use these weapons and destroy ourselves, just like they did. On a quick and interesting side note about these Tall Nordics is the fact that they are normally described as being between 6.5 feet to about 7 feet in height. Since we now understand that the Tall Nordics are most likely a remnant of the Lord God faction, we can now understand that they have obviously readapted to living on Earth. There's also an important clue that we are in fact not dealing with immortal people, and that they do have some type of limited lifespans that at least gave them the ability to have several generations to be able to adapt to living on Earth. This allows us to at least guess that their lifespans may not be much more than 1,000 or so years in length, although they may have been much longer in the past, like ourselves. All of this should make us take a moment and realize that it appears that both sides of this ancient conflict of the gods are still lying to all of us, just as they always have done. It also proves that both sides are incredibly terrified if modern humans ever figure out who they really are, because the hard truth is that both groups represent a clear and present danger to every single one of us, nor can either side really be trusted or believed, for they have always lied to us. More importantly for all is that we will never ever be fully in control of our own destiny, nor will we ever be safe, or will we ever be free as a people or a species until both sides and their influence have been removed from this planet once and for all. With that being said, I do think it is reasonable to think that the Tall Nordics, or better known now to us as the Lord God faction, are the ones we should try to approach and make formal contact with. Because given the sheer fact that their level of technology is clearly far more advanced than our own, I believe we will need their help to defeat the Greys. Which of the two groups I believe the Greys are at the moment by far the greater danger of the two. With the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But even then, ultimately, in the end, even the tall Nordics too will either have to leave this world, or we will need to utterly destroy them without mercy for our own survival. This here finally brings us to the end of our journey into the mystical symbolism of the dream vision of Enoch and the secret esoteric history of creation it unlocks. As I look back over our journey through the mystical symbolism, I can't help but think of the closing word of St. Augustus of Hippo in his famous work, The City of God. It may be too much for some and not enough for others. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos.